All right, so you send in a ton of stuff about living in Puerto Rico, articles and expat guides, even a YouTube comment about someone struggling to find work. It's like paradise, but maybe with some bumps in the road. So let's deep dive into these sources and see what we can find out.
Yeah, it's funny. We've got all these amazing beaches in the sources. Flamenco, Sucia, Bai, Crashbook, Playa Inez, all these names just sound like a perfect vacation. But then you read on, and some of the sources say it's not always easy.
Yeah, it's not all like, sipping cocktails on the beach, isn't it? There's stuff about traffic nightmares, potholes, and even a YouTuber who talked about xenophobia. What was that about?
So this YouTuber, she moved to Puerto Rico from the mainland US, and she talked about sometimes feeling like an outsider. Little things, like people treating her differently. Now, it's important to remember this is just one person's experience.
Right.
Lots of expats say they feel very welcome, but it does make you think about how cultural differences can affect your everyday life.
For sure.
Mm.
It's like a reminder that even in paradise, things aren't always perfect. And speaking of not perfect, another source talked about corruption. Maybe not everywhere, but it's there. Do you remember that story about getting a driver's license? Something about needing motivation.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, things can move pretty slowly, unless you have a little extra motivation, if you know what I mean. You got to grease the wheels a little.
Ah, so that's what they call island time. Not just a relaxed pace of life, but a whole different way of getting things done.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of connects to the whole cost of living thing. Lots of sources talk about how affordable it is, but is it really?
I mean, it's got to be cheaper than the mainland U.S., right?
It is, generally, but not as cheap as you might think for the Caribbean. Think more like $1,500 to $2,500 a month for a single person.
Wow, that's not exactly pennies. Guess those
Yeah.
beautiful beaches come with a price tag.
They do, but there's also a lot of variation depending on where you live. San Juan, the capital, is obviously more expensive, but if you go out to the central mountains, it seems like you can live a lot more cheaply.
Interesting. So you've got some choices to make, right? Like beachfront paradise versus saving some money.
For sure.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about work. We've got this picture from the sources. You ditch your 9 to 5, become a digital nomad, working from a beach cafe. Sounds amazing, but is it realistic?
I was just thinking that. Sounds too good to be true.
You're right to be skeptical. A lot of the sources say the job market's pretty tough, high unemployment. And it's not just about finding any job, it's about finding something that pays enough and uses your skills. Like there was this one comment from Joe Taylor. He was saying how hard it was to find work at 60. It really made me think about the challenges for some people.
Yeah, paradise doesn't solve everything. But some sources also talk about tax breaks for businesses and a growing startup scene. So maybe there's potential there.
That's a good question. There's definitely some opportunity. The tax breaks are meant to attract businesses, and more people are working remotely. But, and this is a big but, reliable internet is a problem. A lot of the sources talk about internet speed and consistency being an issue, especially outside the cities.
So working from that beachside hammock might come with some lag.
Yeah, exactly. It's getting better, but it's something to be aware of, especially if you need a good connection for your work.
Okay, so we've talked about the practical side of things. But what about the culture? A lot of sources say Puerto Ricans are really warm and welcoming. What's it like beyond those first impressions?
It's true, they are. But it's more than just being friendly. It's about family, community, and that whole island time thing we talked about earlier. Imagine life where stores are always packed, no one's in a rush, and conversations just flow naturally. It's a different pace, a different way of thinking about time.
Island time is more than just a saying then. It's a way of life.
Exactly. And to give you an even better picture, think about this. They use bananas in everything, even sandwiches. And you see Puerto Rican flags all over the place. They're really proud of their heritage.
That's cool. It's the little things that really make a place come alive.
Hmm.
But we can't ignore the big stuff either. Safety and infrastructure. Several sources mention crime, poverty, and hurricanes. How do those things factor in?
You're right, you can't ignore that stuff. But with safety, it really depends on where you are. Some areas have more crime, but others are really safe. Like one YouTuber said she felt totally fine even at Walmart, but another expat talked about living in a gated community. So it just goes to show you have to do your research, figure out what each neighborhood is like.
So it's not just about whether Puerto Rico is safe in general, but more about finding the right spot within Puerto Rico. Makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And with hurricanes, the key is being prepared. The sources say they have a great early warning system, and people are pretty used to dealing with them. It's just about being smart and having a plan.
Right, like living anywhere that has natural disasters. You just got to be ready. Speaking of navigating life there, one source talked about a massive wealth gap. What's that about?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Basically, some people live really well while others are struggling financially. It has to do with a lot of things, like historical stuff and economic policies. Something to think about if you're thinking of moving there.
So understanding the money situation is important, just like knowing about the beaches and the cost of living.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about getting around. One source said the transportation system is average at best. What does that even mean?
Yeah, average doesn't tell you much. Like, what are the problems?
Well, it sounds like San Juan has an okay public transportation system, but outside the capital, it's not so good. Buses are crowded, the schedules are unreliable, that sort of thing. Having a car is probably easier, but then you've got traffic and those potholes to deal with.
Sounds like you need some patience to get around, especially if you're not in a big city.
You got it. And it all ties back to that remote work thing we were talking about. If the internet's not great, especially in more rural areas, that's a problem for digital nomads.
Right, it's all about knowing what to expect. Right.
Yeah,
Puerto Rico has a lot to offer, but you have to be willing to roll with the punches a little.
definitely. Now, let's not forget about the other residents of Puerto Rico, the wildlife, I mean. One source talked about extreme wildlife, which sounds a little scary, but what does that actually mean?
Yeah, extreme makes it sound like you're in the jungle or something.
Well, Puerto Rico has a ton of different ecosystems, from rainforests to mangroves. You've got those cute little coqui frogs, iguanas everywhere, maybe even a snake or two.
Oh, wow. So there's a whole wild side to the island, too, not just beaches and cities.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes it so cool. Now, back to the people. We talked about them being warm and friendly, but what about everyday life? One source said that the stores are always packed no matter what time of day it is.
Really? Why is that?
Seems like it's a few things. Shopping is like a social activity, a chance to hang out with friends and neighbors. And then there's that whole island time thing again. Things just move at a different pace.
I'm starting to get it. It's not just separate things like beaches or the cost of living. It's the whole vibe of the place, the whole culture.
Exactly. Now, one thing that really stuck out to me was how festive everything seems to be in Puerto Rico. Like one source said the holidays are crazy with parties all the time.
I bet. With that great weather and everyone being so close, it sounds like one big party.
It does, right. But it's not just the holidays. There's just this general feeling of joy and celebration in everyday life. Music, dancing, being with family and friends. It seems like they really know how to enjoy themselves.
Sounds like there's so much to appreciate beyond just the tourist stuff. It's
Yeah.
about soaking up the culture and the whole way of life there.
Totally. But we do have to talk about some of the tougher issues that came up in the sources. Safety is a big one for a lot of people.
Right. We mentioned how crime rates are different in different areas, but what exactly are people worried about?
Some sources talked about things like theft, especially in tourist spots. They said you have to be aware of your surroundings and not leave your valuables lying around. Basic stuff, really.
So it's not about being scared, it's about being smart.
Yeah, exactly. And being prepared for natural disasters, too. Hurricanes are a real threat, so the sources say you have to know what to do if one hits.
We talked about the early warning systems, but what else can people do to stay safe?
Well, they say you should have a hurricane kit with all the essential stuff, know the evacuation routes, and pay attention to the weather reports. Basically, have a plan and be ready.
It's a reminder that paradise has its downsides, too.
It does, but those challenges are part of what makes Puerto Rico so interesting. Now, there's something that keeps coming up in these sources, even though it's not directly talked about: the political situation.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. What did the sources say about that?
Well, they point out that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, but not a state. So that means people who live there are U.S. citizens, but don't have the same voting rights. It's a weird situation, and the whole relationship with the mainland is always changing. The question of whether Puerto Rico should become a state is a big debate.
One source even called Puerto Rico the oldest colony in the world,
Mm,
which makes you think about the history and all the politics involved.
it does. And while we can't really get into all the details of that debate right now, it's important to know that it affects people's lives in a big way.
So it's another thing to consider when you're thinking about moving there.
Definitely. It's not just about moving to a pretty island. It's about moving to a place with a long and complicated history, a unique culture, and a political system that's still being figured out.
It sounds like there's a lot more to it than just packing your bags and going to the beach.
Yeah, for sure. You need to really think it through, do your research, and be ready for anything. But for the right person, someone who is drawn to Puerto Rico's unique charm and willing to deal with the challenges, it could be an amazing experience.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. From the beaches and the job market to the culture and the politics, we've gotten a good look at what life in Puerto Rico is really like. What are your final thoughts?
I think the main takeaway is that Puerto Rico is a beautiful place with an amazing culture, but it's not always easy. You need to be flexible, adaptable, and open to new experiences. It's not for everyone. It's a place that asks you to really engage with it, to understand it, and to be willing to learn and grow.
It's not just about liking the looks of it. It's about connecting with the place on a deeper level.
Exactly. It's about respecting its history, embracing its culture, and understanding both the good and the bad.
So if someone's listening to this and trying to decide if Puerto Rico is right for them, what advice would you give?
Well, I'd say, first of all, think about what you're really looking for. Are you into the idea of a slower pace of life, a strong sense of community, a really vibrant culture? And are you okay with maybe dealing with some bureaucracy and some infrastructure stuff?
Yeah, sounds like it's more than just wanting to live on a beach, right? You got to be realistic about what it's really like to live there.
Sure. And you got to be proactive. Research different areas, talk to people who've actually lived there, get a feel for what daily life is really like. Don't just go by the tourist brochures or the pretty pictures on Instagram.
So go deeper, look beyond the surface, and try to get to the heart of what it means to be in Puerto Rico.
Exactly. And remember, everyone's different. What works for one person might not work for another. It's about finding your own place, your own niche.
Okay, so we've talked about the practical stuff, the culture, the challenges, but now I'm curious, knowing all this, would you ever consider moving to Puerto Rico?
Honestly, I find it really appealing. The mix of cultures, the beautiful nature, the slower pace of life, it all sounds great. But I'd have to really think about the downsides too, especially the job market and the infrastructure stuff.
Makes sense. It's a big decision. But it sounds like you're going about it the right way.
Yeah.
Being informed, thinking it through, and, having that sense of adventure.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this deep dive will lead to something. Maybe someday we'll be sitting on a beach in Puerto Rico, sipping pina coladas, and thinking back to how this conversation got us here.
That's a great point. This deep dive is just the beginning. It's about sparking your interest, getting you to ask questions, and maybe even inspiring you to explore Puerto Rico for yourself.
And even if you decide it's not for you, just going through this process of learning and exploring is valuable. It opens your mind, challenges your ideas, and makes your life richer.
So whether you're dreaming of beaches or just curious about different parts of the world, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. Who knows what you might discover along the way.
And hey, if you do end up going to Puerto Rico, let us know. We'd love to hear about it.
That's all for our deep dive into Puerto Rico. Thanks for listening.